Have you ever felt like something or someone was waiting for you, even when the world had moved on? Today on Veil Marks, we bring you a story unlike any other. A tale of loyalty, loss, and an unbreakable promise, one that transcended even death. But before we dive into this unforgettable journey, take a moment to hit like, share, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers. Your support means the world and fuels the creation of more heartfelt, high-quality stories like this one. Now let's talk about the Giant Pitbull, a breed both feared and misunderstood. These dogs are not only strong but deeply loyal, intelligent, and protective. And in tonight's story, one such pit bull boards the same bus every night, without an owner, without a destination. Where was he going? Why did no one else seem to notice him? And what would happen when one man finally decided to follow him? This isn't just a story. It's a lesson in love, devotion, and the bonds that even time cannot break. Stay until the very end, because the truth behind this journey will leave you in awe. Hank Lawson had been driving the same night route for over 30 years. Bus number 88, the Midnight Line, rolling through the quiet streets of a city that never quite slept but had its moments of eerie stillness. He had seen it all, drunks stumbling in after last call, exhausted nurses heading home from the graveyard shift, lovers whispering in hushed tones, and even the occasional lost soul with nowhere else to be. But these days, Hank barely paid attention to his passengers. His mind drifted elsewhere. Once, long ago, he had someone waiting for him at home. A warm light in the window, the soft murmur of a television playing in the background, and the scent of lavender from the candle his wife always lit before bed. That was a lifetime ago. Now, his house was dark when he returned. Silent. Too silent. His children had grown, moved away, started lives of their own. And after his wife passed, there was nothing left but the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of his route. Every night was the same. The streets blurred past in streaks of orange light, reflections bouncing off wet pavement. The low murmur of late-night passengers filled the bus, but Hank had stopped listening. Routine was comfort. Routine was predictable. And then, one night, the routine broke. At 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes before midnight, it happened for the first time. The bus doors hissed open at a near-empty stop. Hank barely glanced up, expecting another weary traveler. But instead, a giant pit bull leapt onto the bus. Not just any dog. This one was massive, easily over 100 pounds, its coat a deep, stormy gray, muscles rippling beneath sleek fur. Its eyes, dark, intelligent, locked onto Hank's for just a moment before it padded silently down the aisle and took a seat at the third row, right by the window. It sat still, poised, staring out the window like a passenger waiting for their stop. Hank blinked. The doors shut. The engine groaned as the bus rolled forward. He checked his mirror, expecting someone, anyone, to acknowledge the enormous dog now occupying a seat like it had paid for a ticket. No one did. Not a single passenger reacted. Hank cleared his throat, looking back at the dog. No leash, no collar, no owner in sight. Maybe someone would call out. Maybe a voice from the back of the bus would say, "That's my dog!" But silence filled the space between him and the animal. He shook his head and focused back on the road. Maybe the owner was just quiet. Maybe they'd step up when their stop came. But the stops rolled by, one after the other. Passengers came and went. The city moved in a blur outside. Yet the dog never moved. It just sat there staring, as if watching for something, or someone. At the final stop, Hank turned in his seat, expecting to see the owner rise, call for their dog, and step off. But no one moved. The last passenger had already stepped off at the previous stop. The bus was empty, except for the dog. For the first time that night, a chill settled in Hank's chest. "All right, buddy," he called over his shoulder, keeping his voice light. "End of the line. The dog didn't react. It kept its gaze fixed outside the window, its posture unwavering, almost like it hadn't heard him. Hank sighed, standing up from his seat, feeling the stiffness in his knees. He approached slowly, hesitating before reaching out a hand. "Come on now, let's go," he said, softer this time. The moment his fingers brushed the air near its fur, the dog was gone. Not like it ran, not like it jumped off when he wasn't looking. It was just gone. 1 second it was there, solid and unmoving. The next, there was nothing but an empty seat, the cold vinyl pressing against his fingertips. Hank stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around wildly, under the seats, toward the doors, even out into the street. Nothing. The doors had never opened. The bus was sealed tight. The dog had simply vanished. Hank exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he had imagined it. Long shifts, late nights. It messes with your mind sometimes. But the next night, at exactly 11:57 p.m., it happened again. The bus doors opened at the same stop, and just like before, the gray pit bull leapt onto the bus, walked to the third row, and sat by the window. Hank watched, gripping the wheel. This time he waited. No one called for it. No leash. No owner. Stop after stop passed, and just like the night before, the dog never moved, never barked, never shifted. And when they reached the final stop, gone. Without a sound, without a trace. It continued the next night, and the next. Every single night, same time, same place, same unwavering stare out the window. Hank stopped trying to rationalize it. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a lost pet or a stray that happened to like public transit. Something about this dog was different. He tried to get the attention of other passengers. Do you see that? But every time he pointed it out, the reaction was the same. Confusion. "What dog?" someone muttered. Hank turned, heart hammering. But Titan, yes, that's what he started calling it, was still there. He could see it clear as day. Yet no one else did. No one else reacted. No one else seemed to notice. As if he was the only one who could see it. As if Titan wasn't supposed to be there. And for the first time in 30 years of driving these streets, Hank felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just curiosity, not just confusion, but a deep, unsettling chill down his spine. Titan wasn't just another stray. It was waiting for something, or someone. And Hank had a terrible feeling that sooner or later, he was going to find out what. Hank Lawson had seen strange things in his years of driving bus number 88. The night shift brought with it a certain unpredictability. People wandering in with haunted eyes, whispering to themselves, or simply staring into the void as if the weight of the world sat on their shoulders. But nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. Titan. That was the name Hank had given the massive pit bull that boarded his bus every night at precisely 11:57 p.m. At first, he had dismissed it. Stray dogs had a way of finding places to rest. Maybe it had once belonged to someone in the neighborhood and was simply following an old routine. But Titan never wandered, never begged for food, never sought attention. It simply took its seat at the third row by the window, watching the world pass by with those dark, knowing eyes. What truly disturbed Hank wasn't just the dog's behavior, but the fact that no one else seemed to notice it. One night, as the bus rattled down Main Street, Hank stole a glance at his passengers. A handful of people, some scrolling on their phones, others staring blankly ahead, lost in their own thoughts. He cleared his throat. "Anyone know whose dog this is?" Silence. Not a single head turned. He tried again, louder this time. "Hey, this your dog?" A woman near the front gave him a confused look. "What dog?" Hank frowned. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "That one. Third row." The woman followed his gaze, then looked back at him with an expression that sent a chill down his spine. "Sir, there's nothing there." Hank's breath caught. His eyes flicked to the mirror, locking onto Titan's solid, unmistakable form. The dog was right there, yet she saw nothing. His stomach turned uneasily. He let the matter drop, forcing himself to focus on the road. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she didn't care enough to look. But the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, when the bus reached the last stop, Hank did something different. He waited. He wanted to see how Titan left, if someone finally came for it. The bus was empty except for the dog. Hank turned, ready to call out again. But before the words could leave his mouth, Titan was gone. No movement. No sound. Just an empty seat. Hank exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe fatigue was getting to him, but deep down he knew better. The next night, his curiosity won out. As 11:57 p.m. approached, Hank reached for his phone. If no one else could see Titan, maybe his camera could. He adjusted the rearview mirror, making sure the dog was in frame, and snapped a picture. When he looked at the screen, his blood ran cold. The seat was empty. The bus was empty. But he could see Titan, sitting right there in front of him. He tried again. This time, the screen glitched. Static distortion covered the image, black and white lines like an old, broken television set. Hank's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the phone. He knew technology failed sometimes, but not like this. The next night, he decided to test something else. At 11:55 p.m., just before reaching Titan's usual stop, he shut the doors early and sped past the stop. If the dog wasn't there to board, it wouldn't appear, or so he thought. When he checked the mirror, Titan was already in its seat. Hank's breath hitched. There was no way. The dog had never been outside. It had never entered. But there it was, sitting, waiting, just as it did every night. It wasn't just a stray. It wasn't lost. It was waiting. For what? Hank didn't know, but a strange, uneasy feeling settled over him. A deep, sinking realization that Titan wasn't just another passenger. It was something else entirely. The next night, Hank did something reckless. He decided to follow it. As the last passengers trickled off the bus, Hank waited. The city stretched out beyond the final stop, dim streetlights flickering, sidewalks empty, except for the occasional drifting figure. He watched Titan carefully. The dog remained seated, still watching out the window, unmoving, and then, in the blink of an eye, it stood. It turned toward the door, stepping off the bus with quiet, deliberate steps. Hank's pulse quickened. This was his chance. He killed the engine and hurried after it, stepping onto the cold pavement. Titan moved with purpose, padding down the empty street. Not once did it glance back at Hank, as if it knew he would follow. The city was quiet. Too quiet. Not even the usual hum of distant traffic. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting, and then Hank blinked. Titan was gone. He spun around, searching the shadows, the alleyways, the doorsteps of the sleeping city. Nothing. No footprints. No rustling of movement. No sound. Just silence. And then a thought crept into Hank's mind. Unbidden. Chilling. Titan wasn't wandering. Titan wasn't lost. Titan was looking for something, or someone. And for the first time since this all began, Hank wasn't just curious anymore. He was afraid. Hank Lawson had spent weeks haunted by the presence of Titan, the giant gray pit bull that boarded his bus at exactly 11:57 p.m. every night. He had tried everything, closing the doors early, taking photos, even asking passengers if they saw the dog. But nothing made sense. Titan always appeared. No one else seemed to notice him. And every night when the bus reached the final stop, Titan simply vanished. The more Hank thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. He had lived long enough to know that life was filled with unexplainable things. But this wasn't just strange. It was something deeper, something that felt unfinished. Like the story wasn't complete, and Hank needed to know why. So that night, he made a decision. He was going to follow Titan. As the bus rolled through its usual route, Hank kept glancing at the mirror, watching the dog sit in its usual place, third row, right by the window. Outside, the city was asleep, bathed in flickering streetlights and the occasional neon glow from an all-night diner or liquor store. The bus made its stops, passengers trickled in and out, but Titan remained motionless. Watching, waiting. Hank's fingers tightened on the wheel. "What are you waiting for?" Finally, at the last stop, the bus hissed to a halt. The doors swung open. Titan stood up. For the first time, Hank saw it move with purpose. Not aimlessly, not like a lost animal. It strode forward, its massive form passing silently down the aisle. It stepped off the bus, and it didn't look back. Hank hesitated only a second before pushing himself out of his seat. His heart pounded as he stepped off the bus into the night air, a chill immediately settling into his bones. Titan was already moving. Hank's breath formed mist in the cold night as he followed, his footsteps echoing on the deserted pavement. The city at night had its own rhythm, distant sirens, the occasional honk of a taxi. But here, where Titan led him, it was eerily silent. The dog's pace was steady, unhurried, like it knew exactly where it was going. Hank's gut tightened. There was something deliberate about Titan's movements, something that made Hank feel like he wasn't just following, he was being led. The further they went, the more the world around them seemed to fade. Streetlights flickered overhead. A newspaper stand, abandoned for the night, creaked as the wind picked up. The smell of damp asphalt and old city air clung to everything. Titan turned a corner. Hank followed, and stopped dead in his tracks. Up ahead, looming in the darkness, stood a building Hank hadn't seen in years. A hospital. Or at least, it used to be. The North Haven General Hospital had been shut down years ago. Hank remembered hearing about it in passing. Budget cuts, not enough funding, something about the city needing to prioritize newer medical centers. Now it stood silent, forgotten, its windows dark, its walls weathered by time. Titan had stopped at the entrance. It stood there, staring at the doors, waiting. For what? For Hank. He swallowed hard, his breath shallow. Every part of him screamed to turn around, to get back on the bus, to forget this ever happened. But he couldn't. Not after weeks of unanswered questions. Not after everything he'd seen. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Titan turned and walked through the open doors. Hank hesitated for only a second before following it inside. The air inside was stale, heavy, filled with the scent of old antiseptic and dust. The dim emergency lights cast an eerie glow on the cracked tiles beneath his feet. Hank's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as he moved deeper into the building. Titan padded ahead, silent, certain. The deeper they went, the colder it got. Hank rubbed his hands together, exhaling sharply. The temperature had dropped noticeably, like the warmth of the outside world couldn't reach this place. He passed old, abandoned nurses' stations, chairs still tucked under desks, computers covered in a thin layer of dust. The remnants of a place once filled with life, now long forgotten. Titan led him down a hallway, past doors with faded room numbers, past peeling posters that once reminded people to wash their hands. And then, Titan stopped, in front of a single hospital room. Hank's breath caught in his throat. The door was slightly ajar. A faint beeping sound came from inside, the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. But that didn't make sense. This hospital had been abandoned. There shouldn't be anyone here. Hank took a step forward, pulse hammering. He hesitated for only a second before reaching for the door. He pushed it open, and what he saw stopped him cold. Inside the room, lying motionless in a hospital bed, was an old man, frail, weak, eyes half open. But it wasn't just the man that made Hank's blood run cold. It was the name on the clipboard attached to the foot of the bed. the name that sent a jolt through Hank's chest, the name that matched the collar Titan didn't wear. For weeks, Hank had wondered why Titan was here, why it boarded the bus every night, why it sat in that same spot, why no one else could see it. And now, standing in this hospital room looking at a man barely clinging to life, he finally understood. Titan wasn't lost. Titan wasn't searching. Titan was waiting. For him. For this moment. For the only person who still remembered. And for the first time since this all began, Hank felt the weight of the truth settle over him. Heavy, undeniable. Titan had come back for his owner, and Hank had just walked into the final chapter of their story. Hank stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. The dim hospital room felt impossibly quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Soft, steady, like a clock counting down. Titan, the giant pit bull that had haunted his bus every night, now stood at the foot of a frail old man's bed. The man looked small, his body sunken into the mattress, his skin pale and thin like parchment. His breath came slow, each inhale a struggle, each exhale like a whisper fading into the still air. But even in his weakened state, there was something unmistakably familiar about him. Hank swallowed hard. The dog didn't move, didn't turn to look at Hank. It just stood there, still and silent, watching the man. Waiting. Hank took a slow step forward, his boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. That's when he noticed. The old man's fingers were twitching. Not in distress, not in pain, but as if he was trying to reach for something. His lips moved. Barely. Just the faintest shift of his mouth. And then one word, a name. Barely above a whisper, but clear enough that Hank heard it. Titan! Hank's stomach dropped. His hands curled into fists as he tried to steady himself. The pieces of the puzzle, the long nights, the unanswered questions, the ghostly presence of a dog that no one else could see. They were all clicking into place now. This man had been waiting. For his dog. Before Hank could say a word, a nurse appeared beside him. She was middle-aged, her face kind but tired, the way nurses always seemed to be. She glanced at Hank, then at the old man. "You must be family," she murmured. Hank shook his head. "Number I was just passing through." The nurse didn't seem surprised. Maybe she was used to strangers coming and going in places like this, where the lonely waited out their final days with no one at their bedside. She exhaled softly and looked toward the man in the bed. "He's been calling that name for days now," she said, her voice low, careful. Hank's throat tightened. "Titan?" She nodded. "At first we thought it was someone's name. Maybe a son, an old friend. But no one ever came. No visitors, no calls." Her gaze drifted to the sleeping man, sadness pooling in her eyes. "Then one of the older staff members recognized the name, said he used to have a dog, a big one, from what I hear." Hank's mouth went dry. "He loved that dog," the nurse continued. "People say they were inseparable, but—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "That was years ago. The dog's been gone for a long time." Hank felt something in his chest tighten, his pulse slow and heavy. He glanced at Titan. The dog hadn't moved. It stood like a statue, silent and unwavering, as if it had always been here, as if it had never left. His fingers curled against his palm. "Are you sure?" he asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. The nurse gave him a small, sad smile. "I'm sure." Hank exhaled shakily. He turned back toward the bed, studying the man's face, lined with age, worn by time, and yet, beneath it all, there was something unmistakable. Recognition. It hit him like a freight train. Hank knew this man. Not well, not personally. But he had seen him before, years ago, a homeless man, ragged and tired, riding his bus night after night. He used to sit near the back, always keeping to himself. But there was one thing Hank remembered most. He was never alone. He had his dog, a massive pit bull, always by his side. Hank had seen them together countless times. The man had always looked at his dog the way people look at the last thing in the world they can trust. The kind of love that didn't need words. But then, one night, he stopped showing up. And right after that, Titan started appearing. Hank staggered back a step, gripping the doorframe as the weight of realization crashed over him. Titan had been riding the bus alone ever since, because his owner had disappeared, because he had been waiting. And now, as the old man lay in this bed hovering between two worlds, Titan was finally here. Hank swallowed the lump in his throat, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. The old man stirred again, his lips barely moving, but the whisper came once more. "Titan." The dog's ears twitched. Slowly, for the first time since entering the hospital, Titan moved. It took one step forward, then another, and then it did something that made Hank's breath hitch. Titan gently laid its massive head on the bed, right beside the old man's frail hand. A soft, content sigh escaped the man's lips. His fingers, weak and trembling, found Titan's fur, and for the first time in years, they touched. The heart monitor beeped softly in the background. The room wrapped in a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Titan didn't move. It didn't bark, didn't whimper. It just stayed there, letting the old man's fingers rest against its coat, like nothing had ever changed, like it had never been gone. And in that moment, Hank knew Titan had been waiting all this time, not for a place, but for a person. And now, finally, he had found him. Hank stepped back, giving them space, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't his to claim. The nurse beside him exhaled softly. "I guess," she murmured, "some promises really are forever." Hank swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "Yeah," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I guess they are." Hank stood motionless in the dim hospital room, his gaze fixed on the frail old man resting on the bed, his fingers weakly clutching Titan's fur. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady, but each breath the man took seemed lighter, thinner, as if time itself was slipping through his grasp. The reality of the moment was sinking in. Titan hadn't been astray. He hadn't been wandering without reason. He had been waiting. For this man. For this moment. Hank swallowed, a strange weight settling in his chest. Something about the man's face, the slope of his jaw, the deep-set wrinkles carved by time, tugged at the edges of Hank's memory. He had seen him before. But where? And then, like an old reel of film flickering back to life, he remembered. It had been years ago, a different time. The night shift had always brought its share of regulars, passengers who weren't just passing through, but who depended on the bus for warmth, shelter, and sometimes the closest thing to human connection they could find. And among them had been a man and his dog. Hank could still picture them as if it were yesterday. The man had been rough around the edges, his clothes worn, his hands calloused, his face lined with the exhaustion of a life lived without comfort. But what Hank remembered most wasn't the man's appearance. It was the way he always sat with his dog, Titan. Even back then, Titan had been impossible to miss. A massive, powerful pit bull, yet calm, composed, always by the man's side like a silent guardian. His thick gray coat was streaked with age, his dark eyes filled with an unspoken intelligence. They never sat near anyone else. Always near the back, always together. Hank had driven them countless nights, watching the man murmur to Titan, sometimes smiling, sometimes just staring out the window in thought. One night, as the bus hummed through the quiet city, Hank had broken his usual silence. "Nice dog," he had said over his shoulder. The man had looked up, surprised. Then, after a pause, he had smiled, a rare thing, small and weary, but real. "He's all I've got," the man had said, patting Titan's broad head. Hank remembered how Titan had leaned into the touch, pressing his weight against his owner like he understood every word. "Been with me since he was a pup," the man continued. "Ain't never left my side." Hank nodded, glancing at them through the rearview mirror. "Must be nice, having that kind of loyalty." The man chuckled softly, scratching behind Titan's ear. "You don't find loyalty like this anymore," he had murmured. "But Titan, he's different. He's family. He ain't ever gonna leave me." Hank had said nothing, because what was there to say? Some people were lucky enough to have family by blood. Others? They found it in the ones who never walked away. And then, one night, they were gone. No man, no dog, just an empty seat at the back of the bus. Hank had noticed immediately. He had told himself that maybe they had moved on. Maybe the man had found a better place to stay. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Then, days later, Titan had appeared. Alone. The first time Hank had seen him board the bus without his owner, his gut had twisted. Titan had walked to the exact same seat, sat down, and stared out the window, waiting. At first, Hank had assumed the man would show up eventually, call for his dog, step onto the bus like nothing had changed. But night after night, Titan kept coming back, and the man never did. Hank had never allowed himself to dwell on it. He had buried the unease, telling himself that maybe Titan had just gotten lost, that maybe the man would return someday. But now, standing in this hospital room, watching Titan and his owner finally reunite, Hank knew the truth. Titan had never been lost. He had never left. Because he had promised he wouldn't. Even when the world had taken his owner away. Even when there was no warm place left to rest. Even when no one could see him, acknowledge him, or call his name. Titan had kept his word. Because loyalty like that? It doesn't fade, it doesn't die, it waits. Until the moment it is finally needed. Hank exhaled shakily, rubbing his hands over his face. The weight of the years pressed against his chest. Had Titan known, even back then, that his owner was still out there somewhere? Had he felt the pull of an unfinished promise, an unspoken goodbye? Hank didn't know, but he believed it. And now, finally, the waiting was over. Titan had done what he had set out to do, and as Hank watched the dog lay his head against the frail hand of the only person who had ever truly belonged to him, he felt something shift in the air, a peace, a quiet understanding, a promise fulfilled, and Hank, for the first time in weeks, no longer felt haunted. Because Titan hadn't been a ghost. He had been a guardian, and now his watch was finally over. The air in the hospital room was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that only comes when time itself seems to hold its breath. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was soft, almost fragile, like it, too, knew the weight of this moment. Hank stood motionless near the doorway, barely daring to breathe. His eyes flickered between Titan, the massive pit bull who had haunted his bus for weeks, and the frail man lying in the hospital bed. And then, it happened. The man stirred. A slow inhale, uneven and weak, but enough to lift his eyelids just a fraction. His gaze was hazy, lost somewhere between dreams and reality. For a moment, it seemed as though he wouldn't see anything at all, but then his eyes landed on Titan, and something inside him broke open. A single tear slipped down his weathered cheek, his lips parting just enough to let out a breathless whisper. "Titan, you're back." The words were barely more than air, but they carried a lifetime of longing, of sorrow, of hope that had refused to die. Titan, unmoving until now, took a slow step forward. His massive paws made no sound against the linoleum floor as he approached the bedside. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Titan had found what he was looking for. And now, he was home. Hank felt something tighten in his chest as he watched the dog carefully, gently, lower his head onto the frail hand of the man who had waited so long. It was a touch so simple, so heartbreakingly familiar, that it shattered the last barrier holding back the old man's tears. His fingers, thin and trembling, curled weakly into Titan's fur, as if afraid that if he let go, the dog would disappear, as if afraid that this wasn't real. The man let out a shaky breath, his lips curving into the smallest, softest smile. "I'm sorry, Titan." His voice cracked, raw with emotion. "I knew you wouldn't leave." The words hung in the air, suspended in time, a confession and a truth all at once. And Titan, who had waited years for this moment, did not move. He did not pull away. He simply stayed, as if to say, "There's nothing to forgive," as if to say, "I was never really gone." The heart monitor beeped again, slow and steady, then slower still, until at last, silence. A final breath escaped the old man's lips, soft and peaceful, his fingers still entwined in Titan's fur. Hank felt his own breath catch. The room had grown impossibly still, as if the world itself was bowing its head in quiet reverence. Titan remained where he was. But then, slowly, he lifted his head. For the first time since entering the hospital, his dark eyes turned toward Hank. And in them, Hank saw something that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't loss, it was relief. A quiet, unshakable peace, as if the weight Titan had carried for so long had finally lifted, as if his mission, his purpose, had finally been fulfilled. And then, before Hank could say anything, before he could take a step forward or even process what was happening, Titan began to fade. It was slow at first, a soft shimmer in the dim hospital light. His solid form seemed to waver, his edges becoming indistinct, as though he were made of mist and memory rather than flesh and bone. Hank's eyes widened. He wanted to call out, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Titan turned his gaze back to the man in the bed, watching him one last time, and then he was gone. No sound, no movement, no trace of paws on the tile, no shadow lingering in the room, just an empty space where he had been. And yet, Hank knew, Titan hadn't left. Not really. Somewhere, beyond what Hank could see or understand, Titan was still there, waiting, watching, keeping a silent, eternal vigil over the man he had loved more than life itself. And now, finally, they were together again. For good. Hank let out a slow breath, his hands resting on the edge of the bed. He reached forward, hesitantly, and placed a hand over the old man's now still fingers. They were cold, but not empty, because even though Titan was no longer there, his presence lingered. Hank didn't need to see him to know. He could feel it. A warmth in the air, a stillness that wasn't loneliness but peace, a promise kept. And for the first time in a long time, Hank understood something deep in his bones, something that had taken decades to truly see. Some bonds never break, not even in death, not even in time. Titan had never given up. He had never stopped waiting. And now, his job was done. With one last glance at the old man, Hank straightened, exhaling slowly. His chest felt lighter, his heart no longer weighed down by the questions that had plagued him for so long. He turned toward the door, taking one last look at the room, at the peaceful stillness left behind. And then, just as he stepped into the dim hospital hallway, a cold breeze brushed past him. It wasn't from the air conditioning, it wasn't from an open window. It was something else, something soft, gentle, like a farewell, like a whispered thank you, like the last echo of a promise that would never fade. Hank closed his eyes for a moment, letting it settle deep into his soul. Then, without another word, he walked away. For the first time in weeks, the bus felt different. Hank sat behind the wheel, his hands resting on the smooth, worn surface, feeling the low hum of the engine beneath his fingertips. The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the pavement, the glow of neon signs reflecting off the rain-slicked roads. It was a city he had known for decades, a route he could drive with his eyes closed. And yet, tonight felt new. Titan was gone, and Hank knew deep in his bones he wouldn't be coming back. The realization wasn't sudden. It had settled over him slowly, like the first light of dawn creeping into the sky. Ever since that night in the hospital, since the old man had taken his last breath with Titan at his side, Hank had known that whatever had kept the dog lingering in this world had finally let go. The dog who had ridden his bus at exactly 11:57 p.m. every night, who had sat in the same seat, staring out into the city with an unshakable patience. His journey was complete. Hank had thought that maybe, just maybe, Titan would still be there. That even after finding his owner he might return, a lingering presence, a habit too deeply ingrained to break. But the first night after the hospital, the doors had opened at the usual stop, and Titan hadn't appeared. For the first time in weeks, the seat by the window was empty. At first, Hank found himself checking the mirror out of habit, expecting to see that massive gray form curled up against the cold vinyl. He'd catch himself waiting at the stop for just a few seconds longer than usual, searching the darkness for the familiar silhouette. But Titan never came. And with each passing night, Hank understood more and more. Titan had never been lost. He had never been astray. He had been waiting for the moment when he could finally keep the last promise he had made. And now, he had. Days blurred together, then a week, then two. The city moved on as it always did, uncaring, unchanging. The same streets, the same tired passengers shuffling onto the bus, murmuring polite acknowledgments or sinking into exhausted silence. But the bus felt quieter, not the usual kind of quiet, the kind that weighed heavy, like something missing, something unfinished. This was a different quiet, a peaceful one. For the first time in a long time, Hank didn't feel haunted. Then, one night, as he pulled up to Titan's usual stop, Hank did something he hadn't done in years. He let the door stay open just a little longer, a few extra seconds, just to see, just to make sure. But the sidewalk remained empty. The street lamp above flickered, buzzing faintly against the cool night air. The pavement was cracked, littered with remnants of fallen leaves, but there were no paw prints, no shadow moving beneath the dull glow of the streetlight, no quiet padding of heavy paws against the concrete. Nothing. And somehow, Hank knew. Titan was gone. Truly gone. But for some reason it didn't feel like a loss. It felt right. Like something had been put back in its place, like something that had been off balance for years had finally, quietly, settled. Hank exhaled, his breath fogging up slightly in the cool air. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he reached for the lever, ready to close the doors and move on. And then, a breeze. Software. Cool. It curled through the open doors, gentle as a whisper. Hank froze. There was no wind tonight. The air had been still as glass only moments before. Yet now, a soft current drifted through the bus, curling around him, brushing lightly against his skin. It wasn't cold. It wasn't unsettling. It was familiar, like a thank you, like a farewell, like the last remnant of a presence that had never truly left. Hank turned his head, his eyes landing once more on Titan's seat. And for a moment, a flicker, a heartbeat of time, he could have sworn he saw the faintest outline of a massive gray pit bull sitting there, watching him, not waiting, not lost, just watching. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. Hank's lips parted slightly, but he didn't move, didn't question it, didn't try to chase the moment. He just smiled, not a sad smile, not a broken one, but one of understanding, because now he knew. Titan wasn't coming back, because he didn't need to. His promise had been kept. His journey was over, and that was enough. Hank exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his heart no longer weighed down by the questions that had plagued him for so long. He reached for the lever, closing the doors with a soft hiss. The bus rumbled forward, slipping into the quiet streets of the city, headlights casting long beams of light against the dark pavement. And as he drove, Hank found himself whispering under his breath, just loud enough for the wind to carry it away. "You did good, Titan. You kept your promise." The road stretched ahead of him, endless as always. But for the first time in a long, long while, Hank didn't feel alone. Some say dogs are only with us for part of our lives, but for them, we are their whole world. And sometimes their love refuses to fade, even when life takes them away. Titan kept his promise. He waited. He never abandoned the man who had once meant everything to him. Because love like that does not disappear. It lingers, watching over us, even when we can no longer see it. And Hank? He left that night not with sadness, but with peace. The bus rolled on, as it always did, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. And now I want to ask you, have you ever had a pet that seemed to understand you more than words ever could? Have you ever felt the presence of something, even after it was gone? Share your stories in the comments. I would love to hear them. Thank you for watching Veil Marks. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because here we don't just tell stories, we keep their memories alive. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never forget, some promises last forever.